Hello, everyone. Let's take a moment of reflection, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, thank you very much. A lot of smiling faces here tonight. Some of us had so much fun the first half of the day that we have come back for more tonight. So I think we got out of here at 12:30 or 1 this afternoon, and some of you were here, and we're glad you're back with us. So now that we've all been welcomed, anyone that's never been to our town meeting before? Okay, to my left, your right rear, there's a table back there that should have the agenda and so forth on it, if you'd like to follow along. And thank you for being here.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir?
can I make a statement about Peter Freer, why he's not here? He's okayed it, and I was asked by the group.
Whatever you want to do, Mr.
Just to give everybody a notice to why Commissioner Freer is not here tonight, he's in Charlotte with his 26-year-old son Dylan, who's been diagnosed with aplastic anemia and another very serious blood disease. He was tested again today, and he has a sister who's qualified to give him a bone marrow transplant, and we'll do that probably in 3 to 4 weeks. So Peter will be back with us very soon. He'll drive back, but he's been with his son for the rest of this last week.
I'm sure we all keep the family in our prayers.
Yeah.
Anything else before we continue? Let's stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance. Flag on my right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It's time for us to consider the agenda, and Mr. Hewitt, I believe you said we had one that was going to make a request or something.
If I could refer to the town attorney and Mr. Wright, do y'all have any additions to the agenda?
I think we'd like to have a very brief 2 or 3 minute closed session right before my report, which I guess is item 7, to pass on to, quote, new news.
Executive session at 6:30.
Very brief.
All right. Anything else to be considered in regards to the agenda to be approved? So I'm asking for a motion to approve the amended agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All righty. We're ready to consider the minutes of the special meeting, February the 20th. All in favor?
Aye.
I'm gonna try to speed this thing. If you don't like my procedure, just yell at me. Is anyone that objects to approving all 3 sets of the minutes?
That's perfect.
I just have a comment on the February 20th minutes.
Special or regular?
The regular meeting,
All
on
right.
the 20th. Go ahead. On page 3, under the audit report, can we go back and maybe check the recording? The first sentence there, it says he explained there are 2 findings, and then later on he talks about it again. Mr. Thompson stated on page 57, there are two findings. But I think what the term on 57 is significant findings. So if we could modify the document, I would appreciate it.
You got that, Madam Clerk?
Yes, sir.
Anyone object to the change?
No, sir, it's correct.
Okay. I'm looking for approval as amended.
I move we approve the amended agenda.
No, the minutes.
Minutes, the
Minutes.
minutes.
All right, everybody happy? All right. Number 6, public comments on the agenda items. My understanding is we have no requests.
Nothing, nobody signed it.
All right. So now we are at 6:30 for the request to go into executive session. And Madam Clerk, do you want us to run upstairs? Is that what?
We could go wherever, you could hear if you go on that route.
All right,
so,
we
yeah.
need a motion to go into executive session.
Do you
So
want me to,
moved.
do you want me to read the reason
Yeah,
really?
you can go ahead and read it.
According to North Carolina General Statute 143-318-11A3, consult with attorneys.
And you made a motion, John.
Yes, sir.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second, Ms. Pat. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, we're gonna go into executive session. We're gonna run upstairs. Or just 2 or 3 minutes.
I'll take us on to get this.
Yeah, like the short meeting this morning. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, we can say.
Oh my God, you just can't. No, it's not, because I was originally over there to care. I wore something to
It's gone.
cold air came.
Trust me, it's gonna get warmer.
We're gonna push it just as hard as we can. Okay, I need a motion to come out of executive session. There was nothing that took place other than we just listened to the attorney.
So moved.
Have a motion to come out. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. We are out of executive session, and we are back in regular session. All right. So we are at 6.5 on the agenda. Mr. Clark Wright is going to be our first speaker, but before he speaks, we've had some interesting news which we were made aware of in the back room. So here's some ground rules that we're going to have to follow tonight. The speakers that we've been fortunate enough to gather tonight, we're going to hear them all. They are all going to stay to the end. Those of you that have questions, we're going to ask that you write down the speaker's name and write down the question. We're going to gather those questions, and at the end, after the last speaker has spoken, we're going to go back and go through the questions. Okay? There are many reasons why we're doing this way. If you don't like it, I'm sorry. If you like it, great. But we've got our instructions. So anyway, that's the way it's going to be done tonight. We're glad you're here, and we're very mindful of the time. So we're going to ask the speakers to speak with as little excessive words as possible. I'm going to ask the speakers to come to the microphone to my right. Speak into the microphone. If you in the audience cannot hear or understand, raise your hand, and I will remind people to talk into the microphone. Okay? All right.
I promise, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, sir.
My name's Clark Wright with Davis Hartman Wright. I'm an attorney who specializes in environmental and regulatory law. I've been retained by the town to give them advice in connection with the ongoing process of the federal permitting for the terminal growing project, as well as the state permitting, which would come afterward. For tonight, the only thing I want to do is kind of let you know where we are, which is one of the reasons for the process that we're doing here. We're in the middle of a decision-making process by the Corps of Engineers as well as by this board. And so it's really important that things be done right. And the final decision that the Corps will make is a document called a record of decision, which is both a decision on the permits that are being sought from the federal government, so-called Section 10 and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act permits, as well as the final step in the so-called NEPA process, or National Environmental Policy Act process, which is the process that has taken forever and a day and recently resulted in formal publication of the final EIS on the federal permits. And the NEPA document is designed to inform both the federal decision maker, this board, and the public about the various potential impacts and consequences, both good and bad, associated with not only the proposed activity that the applicant seeks, but a range of alternatives. And it's only 1,800 and some odd pages long if you're really, really interested in getting to sleep quickly. The other point I just want to make is that there's a whole bunch of process that literally, of course, started with the General Assembly in 2011 about state permits, and that's under the CAMA program is sort of the lead vehicle for that. And due to advice that is now being given to the Division of Coastal Management by their lawyers, that process cannot even formally start until the federal process has gotten at least to the stage it has now with the publication of the final environmental impact statement. A little bit of a gray area, is whether the CAMA process could begin prior to the issuance of the Federal Record of Decision, or ROD. The board has kind of gone ahead and preemptively answered that question by saying they're going to put a temporary freeze on any further processing pending collection of what we're doing here tonight, of good information from a lot of different perspectives, which the board's going to take into consideration as it makes its decision. And that's about all I think needs to be said about where we are in terms of the process, and I think we should hear from the other speakers.
Thank you, sir. Spencer Rogers.
My name is Spencer Rogers. I'm a coastal engineer and geologist with North Carolina Sea Grant. I'm housed at UNC Wilmington Center for Marine Science. And as part of Sea Grant, if you're not familiar with our program, we're basically the wet equivalent of the land grant college program and the cooperative extension program. And for that reason, I am free advice to anybody in the state, and I've been asked by David to talk to you tonight about inlets, jetties, and groins in at least general terms, and to look at some of the issues around terminal groins and other structures along the coast and in the vicinity of inlets. So if I can figure out how to work this.
Did it get turned off on the side?
Green means go.
Sorry.
I'm in a hurry now. Okay. First of all, how do I explain inlets in 15 or 20 minutes? Not easy. But I think it's important to think about inlets not in just one direction or another. We know in North Carolina we've got migrating inlets that are moving rapidly along the shoreline in one direction or another. In those cases, you can think of them as the inlet shoreline is moving up and down the island. One island accretes as the other island erodes. The classic example right now, and the fastest mover in the state, is Topsail Inlet, north end of Topsail Island, and it's moving about 90 feet per year to the south every single year, and the island south of it is eroding at a similar rate. So that's the inlet shoreline itself that's moving around. But there aren't many migrating inlets left in the state for a variety of reasons. Some have closed, some have been stabilized by other methods, and most of the inlets we've got, migration is not the actual primary problem. The problem is not on the inlet shoreline between the islands, it's on the ocean shoreline in the vicinity of the inlet. So in those cases, working with the Science Panel on Coastal Hazards for the CRC, what we've identified in some pending inlet hazard area efforts is the areas where the variability adjacent to the inlet is considerably different than the areas away from the inlet. And what we will eventually be proposing, and some work has already been released on defining inlet hazard areas with those areas separated from the ocean areas that have separate issues. And the point of that is that in those areas, you don't have to worry just about a hurricane coming at you from the ocean front. You really need to look at the inlet shoreline to see where it's going and what it's doing to you at the same time. So the normal process in the middle of the island are different than on the ends. And in this case, from Tubbs Inlet, the southeast or west side is accreting in this particular case, and the other side is eroding. And these are frequently tied to the location of the primary offshore channel. In this case, it's hugging the left-hand side. That causes accretion on the left side and erosion on the other. That only lasts a certain length of time before it shifts back with a more efficient channel going the other way, and those erosion issues reverse. It goes the other way. So the characteristics of these near inlet areas is that they oscillate a whole lot faster than non-inlet areas. And that's important to consider when you're looking at management of those areas. All right, let's take a look at briefly some of the erosion statistics coming out of not the latest data, but at least through 2009 that were produced by Division of Coastal Management. It's about 70 years of shoreline change from aerial photography. Statewide, 66% of the state is eroding, and 34% of the state is accreting or relatively stable. But if we separate that out into inlet and non-inlet areas, These inlet hazard areas, the science panel has identified, account for about 23% of the shoreline. So that's a lot more than just the opening of the inlet. That's a significant distance in the adjacent shorelines, in the shorelines adjacent to each inlet opening. Now, if we look at the non-inlet areas, so that's the area not influenced by the inlet, the median erosion rate, that's half the state is eroding at a rate lower than that, and the other half is somewhat higher than that. That median number is 9/10 of a foot per year, something a little less than a foot. Now, a lot of that is probably driven by sea level rise historically, but there are a lot of other reasons that make that faster. If we compare only the areas within the inlet hazard area, the number jumps to 4.3 feet per year. And if we look at that in terms of how that compares with the non-inlet areas, that it's basically 5 times faster erosion in these inlet hazard areas than the non-inlet hazard areas. So in this number, the erosion means it's disappearing, it's going away. But what isn't included in that number is the variability. And the variability that we found is typically on the order of at least 10 times faster in going and coming in an annual or decadal scale. And it could be much higher than that. In some cases, it could be as high as 100 times faster. So the net result of this is the inlet areas, near inlet areas are eroding faster, and they're oscillating a whole lot quicker than that. So expect change when you get near inlets, and you can usually expect problems. Well, a question I get fairly often is, why the heck are we considering terminal groins now? And I think there's a very clear reason for that. Having followed beach nourishment in North Carolina for a long time, we started back in the 1960s and have been at it quite a while, but that's been in jumps and starts, and it's been very much a learning exercise as we've gone along. And first it was that, well, you just build some sand on the beach and you live happily ever after. Doesn't work. Beach nourishment only works where you got to maintain it. And the other thing that we're learning the hard way, in some communities particularly, is that it's not cost effective in high erosion rate areas. So from the previous description, high erosion area is often around the inlet. An area where beach nourishment is not going to work very often is in these near inlet areas. So while the communities have been looking at beach nourishment and trying beach nourishment, there have been some fairly spectacular failures. Ocean Isle, in an add-on project to the Corps of Engineers work, the Corps didn't put the sand there, but the town paid $500,000 extra to put sand on, that would be the east end of the island. They lost it in 2 months. 2 months, $500,000. So beach nourishment in some areas clearly is not going to work, and it's a learning curve from the communities that haven't figured that out in some areas. So if nourishment alone is not going to work, what will work, what might work? All right, definitions. It's important to understand that there are definitions in the way these terms get thrown around. Jetty, by definition, is a navigation structure. It's used to stabilize the navigation channel. It's not there for erosion control. It's there for the navigation project. And it's usually done in pairs, usually twins on each side of the inlet. In contrast, a groin is a structure that's perpendicular to the shoreline, and it's used for shoreline stabilization. So it's got no significant impact in most cases on navigation. If you put it near an inlet, it's not going to affect the navigation very much, but it is there intended for shoreline stabilization in some projects. And a terminal groin would be a groin that's located at the end of a sand transport system. As you'll see, that's quite different than one in the middle of the island, but that's typically around an inlet where the sand transport is ending somewhere up in the estuary. And that's usually a single structure, occasionally a few extras. Now, the big differences in sizes, the jetties in common practice for navigation around inlets are in thousands of feet, mile-type lengths in many cases, and the terminal groin structures are on the order of 5 times smaller or 10 times smaller in most cases. So they're much different in scale as well as in purpose. And the structure is going to vary with the size of the inlet. The bigger the inlet, the bigger both of these would have to be effective. Now, the way these things work is not magic. It's actually pretty simple. That sand is in transport along the shoreline, and it's caused by breaking waves that come in, break on the shoreline, pick up a significant amount of sediment, and then because the waves are coming in at a slight angle, this curving of the wave and the gradual break along the shoreline is creating a current along the shoreline that once the sand is already picked up, it's moved along the shoreline in that direction. So in the case I've got here with the breaking waves, sand is moving from left to right. And that's the same thing the surfer's looking for. That nice curl is sending sand and some water motion with a current in the direction of the longshore current. Now that changes every day, whichever way the waves are coming in, but in most of our beaches, they're dominant systems that push most of the sand one way or another along the coast. And the way these structures work is they're basically sand traps, that if you've got a dominant direction of sand motion, that one side is going to get dammed and prevented from going to the other side. So in the left-hand side, we're trapping sand. The cost you pay for that is a deficit of sand, an equal amount in most cases, on the other side. It's like a dam. You know, one side benefits, the other side loses. That can be a significant problem, as we'll see in some of the other examples. And actually, that may be an ancient slide from Lockwood Folly, but I'm not sure of that. But that will be my only reference to Lockwood Folly. Another example of a groin is a series of groins built by the Navy around the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse for not the lighthouse, but another facility farther to the north. It's the highest longshore transport in the state. It's close to 1 million cubic yards a year going to the south. That's 100,000 dump trucks a year. And if we take a look at what that's done to the shoreline, there's 3 groins in that set just above the lighthouse in Buxton. And if you'll notice, there's a marked change in the direction of the shoreline. That's the deficit created by those 3 groins. And the blue circle is where they moved the lighthouse. A 4th groin was actually an alternative for the Park Service, but they chose to move the lighthouse for 8 times the cost as a reasonable management choice. Now, particularly in the 50s and 60s, groins were in vogue over straight shorelines. And generally the idea was that if you put in one, you know you're going to create a deficit. So you build it over here and you trap some sand on the other side. And then, well, the way you fix it is you put another one on the other side right where the worst erosion is starting to pop up. The trouble with that is you have to keep on going, so that as you proceed along straight shorelines, you end up putting in an awful lot of groins, and the net impact is often not that effective. And if you go to the extreme, one of my favorite examples is Miami Beach back in the 1970s before they buried it in Beachville. That a poor grain of sand didn't have a chance moving along this beach. Everything was locked up with long groins, and there was no longshore transport to move around, so they didn't work. You know, lots of structures, no sediment trapping. So there reaches a point where if you shut down this longshore transport system, you no longer have a way to fill the groins, you no longer have any benefit of the groins. And if we look at the worst erosion problems in the United States, the vast majority of those are located near and adjacent to navigation projects and older jetty systems. One of the classic cases is this one from Ocean City, Maryland. We take a look at the longshore transport is from the top down from north to south in the northeasters. Assateague Island on the south side. We take a look at the original shoreline before the jetty was constructed. That's the red line. It created a great place for the town to build a parking lot and a nice wide beach. But at the same time, the impact on Assateague Island was traumatic, that it turned Assateague into a migrating island. Its original position was the colored box, and it migrated all the way landward of that as the national seashore. And in this case, the jetty eventually filled up and the sand bypassing started over again, and they made some other beach fill projects and managed it. But this is a classic example of downdrift erosion from a solid jetty system that's a significant and severe impact that clearly should be avoided at all costs. So about 50 to 60 years ago, actually one of the changes in jetty design was started right here in our area. The first managed inlet to avoid those updrift collections and downdrift impacts was the Weir Jetty at Masonboro Inlet on Wrightsville Beach. And in this case, again, the transport is from top down, north to south. What the Corps designed in '65 was a low weir area that's built at about mean high water, so that waves transport sand over top of it and allow it to be trapped in a settling basin. I can't point with this thing, can I? Just above the W, or on the tip of the island where the green arrow is located. So sand comes inside the jetty system, it's not trapped on the outside, and that allows it to be picked up with a dredge in shallow water and pumped back to Masonboro Island, or in the case of Riceville Beach, they pump a lot of it back into Riceville Beach Nourishment Project. So if that had not been constructed with the weir, by 50 years after construction, the sand would be out at the tip end of that jetty by the double T's, and Masonboro Island would not exist. So while many of the worst erosion problems were caused by solid jetties before this design change, they've gotten a lot better since, and we're doing a better job at management, fortunately. In this case, that's Masonboro Island again. They're bypassing sand from the inlet over to Masonboro Island. Okay, terminal groins. If you built a sand trap in the middle of just about any island you can think of in the state, it's a very clear decision choice you're making. You're benefiting, assuming there's a longshore net transport in one direction or another, you're going to benefit one property, and the guy on the other side is going to lose sand. Simple, one guy benefits, one guy loses. There are not many places in the state where that's a rational decision for management. So there are good reasons for coastal management and others to restrict groin fields in North Carolina. However, the interesting thing about terminal groins is that what is normally an adverse impact in many cases, in the proper design and implementation, can be turned into an asset rather than a liability. And I'll show you a couple of examples of where that has happened in the past. This is a small screw pile lighthouse down in Boca Grande, Florida. This was back in the 1970s. It was tilting over and about to fall in the ocean. And one of the interesting things about the area is while the lighthouse is circled in the red zone, that first feature you see behind that on the shoreline inside the inlet is a dredge collecting sand as fast as possible. And he's putting it in land-based cars, and they're trucking it away, hauling it away. The reason is that the structure just above it, the smaller structure, is a oil terminal, and the structure behind that is a phosphate terminal for big ships. So they need deep water. They can't tolerate sand burying their structures. So in this case, we've got a lighthouse that's fallen in the ocean or in the inlet, and two places that are dredging like crazy and don't want the sand. So what the terminal groin, in this case, allowed it to do, that's the dredge, was built a recurve structure that's been modified over the years, but it trapped sand under the foundation and prevented it from getting to those other two shipping terminals. And that's actually a month ago at that same beach adjacent to the lighthouse. That's been in there since 1980 or so. Well, getting closer to home at Oregon Inlet, when the bridge was threatened, the state decided to build a terminal groin at Oregon Inlet. The island was eroding at a rate of about 600 feet per year in the last couple of years before it was hardened. They built a structure, a terminal groin, on the south side of the inlet, which is the downdrift side. But because sand moves into the inlet from both directions, not just from the dominant direction, it's always going in the inlet along the shoreline. They built it on the south side to protect the bridge abutment, and it's suspiciously like the landward end of the jetty that was eventually abandoned by the state. But it quickly filled as fast as they built it. It filled in because of the high longshore transport rate at that area. Now, one of the criticisms of the jetty structures in particular, and terminal groins in some cases, is that The inlet areas are good habitat areas because their high oscillations keep bare sand spits as a bird habitat. And in the case of Oregon Inlet, it's pretty much hardened most of the shoreline. There are months and weeks and days where there is a small sand supply inside that jetty, inside that terminal groin, but it's not there as a regular feature. So I think you could safely argue that this was a shoreline hardening structure. In the design of the structure, it was intended to be. It had no interest at the time to make it a porous structure and to consider any habitat on the inside of that structure. There are other more recent terminal groins that have been designed exactly for that purpose. And an old one, I think, is one of an excellent example here in North Carolina is Fort Macon. Fort Macon was built in the 1820s and 30s. It had erosion problems almost from the start. It's the end of Atlantic Beach with Beaufort behind it, Beaufort Inlet on the other side. And if we take a closer up view, in its eroded condition, the shoreline was actually the red line shown here in this drawing back in the pre-Civil War days. The first coastal engineering effort was a radial growing field around the perimeter designed by some guy named Robert E. Lee in his federal days. And that worked somewhat better, but it really didn't get a whole lot better until the terminal groin was constructed in the 1960s through the 70s. It was completed in about 1970. And it was intended to be a solid structure and impermeable, but like many coastal projects, they ran out of money and they didn't put the armor stone on top of it. So it's turned out to be a relatively porous terminal groin structure, and it allows sand from beach nourishment projects, common on Atlantic Beach from the port project, to go through the structure and transport into the inlet. So we take a look at some of these areas over time. As I said, the interesting thing about these terminal groins is that in some cases you can turn what would normally be a liability, not enough sand, into an asset. Who's familiar with Fort Macon? Anybody know what's in the blue circle? It's a Coast Guard dock. So any sand that makes it to the dock gets dredged. They have to pay to haul it away. So in this case, yes, they're trapping sand on the outer edge, and they are allowing some sand to go through. This is 96. A series of spit was formed, not unlike a natural inlet formation. And it's moving around, and that keeps the vegetation off it and ensures that it will be native. And it grows larger after the nourishment projects and shrinks smaller in between. So I'm on record as recommending to the Coastal Resources Commission and to the Legislative Study Commission that I think the CRC should have terminal groins in their permitting kit. I think it's a reasonable option for them to consider at some inlets. And that with that, I'll turn it over to the mayor.
Thank you, sir. Fran Way.
Commissioners, Mayor. Hello, everybody. My name is Fran Way. I'm a coastal engineer with Applied Technology and Management. We are a coastal engineering firm that have been around for over 30 years. We specialize and focus we have 5 offices in the Southeast. We've been working in North Carolina and South Carolina for decades. We have a big engineering team, coastal engineer. Our department head, Dr. Mike Jenkins down in Florida. We have over 10 coastal engineers, all with advanced degrees, either master's degrees or PhDs. We do other things, expert witness testimony, that sort of thing regarding coastal processes. We've been working with the town of Holden Beach for about 15 years now, doing beach nourishment projects, all in the ocean front. Just recently, last year, doing the Central Reach project, putting over 1.3 million cubic yards of material on the beach. Some of my slides are pretty similar to Spencer's, so I'll try to get through them as quickly as possible. This is a image of the top image is from 2008, and the bottom image is from 1993, and you can see there are X's down here on 27 structures that are no longer there in that 2008 area. So there is, in between 1993 and 2008, basically in the late 90s, there are 27 structures that were lost on the east end. And if you go back even further into the 70s, there are even more structures that are lost, and they're even lost a little farther outside that image. So this is just kind of giving you a little history on, and I know some of you have probably heard then, and about the east end in particular. 80s and 90s, the erosion was quite bad. And you can see there's more structure. This is from Dr. Cleary's work and compendiums for the beach inlet management plan. Even today, there's road structure and debris, and especially right before like a nourishment cycle, right when the beach is quite eroded. More recently, this was Hurricane Hannah back in 2008. And we were getting some erosion here, up to about 20 cubic yards per foot. And for reference, that's kind of what FEMA says a 100-year storm will take away, 20 cubic yards per foot. So it was pretty, Hurricane Hannah was particularly significant, especially along the east end. And that brought in FEMA and mitigation. And basically a year or two after this is really when we started this whole process. And I think both the speakers before me were talking about just how long this process can be, and you know, we've been putting years into this, and especially the FEMA, the core EIS process is glacially slow, and so you know, after this, the Board of Commissioners and the town manager and the mayor, they were like, the terminal groins were allowed shortly after this. And this looks like a great spot for that because the erosion is very high in this area. And this is another image from the 90s, and you can just see this is just interesting where you can see all the platted parcels, and they're way out here in the water. And so that's just kind of the erosion just over decades has just been working. The town has been doing a great job over the last 15 or 18 years. Keeping up with this, and then really, and even the Corps kind of stepped up a little bit, but now Corps funding has kind of dwindled in the last 5 or 7 years. So and then but then of course the state has picked up their funding as well, especially for dredging related projects, such as in the inlet, Lockwood Folly Inlet. Even back to the 70s, and Spencer mentioned this before, there was actually 15 groins along the east end of Holden Beach. These are 15 groins right here. All along the east end. There's Holden Beach right here. You can Google it, and there's some papers from the 70s you can find. These are the groins right here, and they're like the nylon bags, and they're relatively temporary. They're kind of on the small side. But they were, in some of these papers, they were documented as working. But those sandbag structures are just so temporary, and even back then they were even more temporary. And then even back in the 1973s, the Army Corps of Engineers, their general design memorandum, they were actually thinking about jetties along the Lockwood Folly Inlet. And actually, the county has kind of come out and expressed an interest in jetties again recently regarding navigation issues and how they're pulling the buoys all the time from Lockwood Folly Inlet. So, we'll see. I've heard some other counties in North Carolina, some other counties in North Carolina that have also considered jetties at some inlets for safer navigation. Inlet structures, and this is kind of where Spencer has already talked about this, but they're common features along the coast. The Coastal Resources Commission did some research, and from Long Island, New York, all the way down to Florida, about 50% of the 154 inlets have some sort of structure. And a lot of times these structures get all lumped together. Jetties, revetments, groins. But And as Spencer also mentioned, decades ago, they would just put these structures in and not put any sand in. But nowadays, they're very good. There's always sediment management incorporated with the structures, and there's monitoring and mitigation. Groin versus jetty, Spencer went over this. Here, again, I have some of the same slides. There's Oregon Inlet and the Masonboro Inlet jetties. So I will skip through those. Here are just some other structures with the recent Bald Head Island terminal groin. I'll end that. Of course, I also have the Fort Macon terminal groin as well. And then even down we're at Long Bay right here, and the southern half of Long Bay is in South Carolina. And there are quite a few structures along the inlets in South Carolina as well. Little River, Pawleys Island, just keep going south, all the way down to Harvey Island. The Bald Head Island terminal groin has been doing really well since it was built. You can see here, these are the little geotextile tube groins that Bald Head Island had. And right here, this is the same image when they built that terminal groin structure. And the terminal groin structure is mostly buried. And that's what we're planning on for the East End terminal groin. And you can see, the erosion back here is all the way back to kind of the mature vegetation and even the houses. And, here is, several hundred feet of beach now with that terminal groin. And there's really not much need for those geotextile tube groins either at this moment. Some other just structures, and Spencer went over this as well. There's the Carolina Beach revetment. There's even the natural outcropping of coquina along Fort Fisher, which is pretty interesting. It's a natural rock outcropping right along the North Carolina coast. Then you have the Fort Macon terminal groin again. So here's the overview of the preferred alternative. And basically, a lot of what Spencer was saying here, this nourishment gets here just about every 2 years, the East End nourishment. The material comes from back here, Lockwood Poly Inlet, the inlet crossing. When the material gets here, it goes that way, and it goes straight back into the inlet. Some of it goes straight back into the inlet, some of it goes that way. This groin is to prevent that material from going straight back into the inlet and having to be dredged back out again. And then this material, from a long view, from a regional sediment transport perspective, the material is getting out here, then it's traveling around those edge shoals, and then hitting here, and then it keeps going along to the Central Reach Project area. And that's kind of the overview, and this is kind of what we've designed. We did extensive numerical modeling, and this modeling was reviewed by coastal engineers in Oak Island, and it was also reviewed by several different Army Corps of Engineers, coastal engineers, here in the Wilmington district as well as the Vicksburg district. This was kind of state-of-the-art modeling, and even here, it's even picking out the shoal attachments, the shoal formations, and the way the edge shoals kind of leave Oak Island and then just slowly travel over across the edge shoal and attach on the east end of Holden Beach. And the model is capturing that. We did lots of modeling, and we modeled from 2000 to 2012. That included Hurricane Hannah, Hurricane Irene. We modeled, because the model is so complicated and runs so slowly, because it's got so many outputs and inputs, we ran it for 4-year intervals, but we ran it over 12 years at 4-year intervals. Here's just an image of kind of the flood tide push. When flood tide comes in, here's the terminal groin. It kind of just pushes everything in, and it really has insignificant effect on any kind of tidal hydraulics of the inlet. We looked at the hydrodynamics with and without the project to make sure that we weren't affecting the inlet and Lockwood Poly Inlet estuarine system. For ebb tides, you can see that obviously the ebb tide, you've got an ebb jet coming through here at the inlet. But you can see there are some kind of eddies along the terminal groin itself. But even without that, the model is also picking up eddies and rip currents elsewhere along the coast. And basically, eddies and rip currents, especially during the ebb tides, can happen anywhere. But still, obviously, the worst part to be is right here in the center of anywhere near the ebb jet of Robert Folly Inlet. And obviously, over the years, whenever there's a safety issue with a swimmer, it's usually out here, pretty far away. Well, not really far away, but it's out here where the current is strongest. And so here's the preferred alternative again. The nourishment, we're going to put most of the nourishment on this side of the groin, and pretty much where it usually is. But we will put a little bit of sand there, and we will cover it, similar to the ball hat. And rigorous post-project monitoring will occur. And this is my last slide. Basically, and this is just kind of repeats what Spencer was saying, it's the design is increasing the beach nourishment longevity from 2 years to 4 years. So there's a lot of good things about increasing that longevity. In terms of the analysis that we submitted, over 30 years, we ran every single we did all the alternatives. We ran. Let me get a drink. We ran no action, nourishment only, intermediate groin with nourishment. We did everything. And over a 30-year cycle, the nourishment and groin alternative saved $12 million over the nourishment only. And that's basically just, with all these alternatives, putting the sand on the beach is the most expensive component of the project, whether it's the groin or the nourishment only. And just to increase that longevity means that you're saving money. Downdrip effects to the Central Reach project. We're not going to have any. We kind of designed it knowing kind of how the regional sediment pattern works as well as the local sediment pattern works. We've got several different processes at play there. And then monitoring will occur. And this is a really long project. And we've put many years into it. And we're really close to completing this EIS process, which has been, painfully slow. And the Corps really just doesn't have any kind of deadlines. They just kind of do it on their own. And, this process, was supposed to be 4 years, and now we're here on year 6. But as an example, another example, the beach looks really good right now. I was down there today. The Central Reach project was put about a year ago, and that put about 1.3 million cubic yards of material down. And then the East End project also got put material down. But as an example, the Central Reach project was permitted back in 2012, and it wasn't constructed by the town until 5 years later. So basically the town was just sitting on that permit for 5 years, getting your easements together, getting financing together. But you had that permit, and you had that in your back pocket. And even though you didn't act on it for 5 years, you still had that permit. And our recommendation is similar to this, is get through that process, get that permit, but you don't have to build it right away. You could wait 5 years. You could not do it at all, ever. But you still have it in your back pocket, and you've got that alternative and that extra tool. And so that's kind of what we think. We just seem to be about 98% through this process, and we want to just kind of finish that and then kind of make a decision. But there really is no reason to stop this 6-year project, the 6-year process right now. And that's pretty much That's all I have to say.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
We're gonna give you an opportunity to say more in a few minutes. My understanding is Steve Dial is not here, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, in that case, Professor Andy Coburn.
He's not here,
All
Mayor.
right.
He asked me to read his comment letter. I'll be happy to do so with the caveat that it's his words, not mine.
All right, sir.
Professor Coburn emailed this letter to my law office on April the 5th. My name is Andrew Coburn, and I am Associate Director of the Program for the Study of Developed Shorelines at Western Carolina University. I appreciate the opportunity to share my professional opinion regarding the town's efforts to construct a terminal groin on the east end of the island adjacent to Lockwood Folly Inlet. Program for the Study of, well, I'm going to use the acronym, PSDS, was established at Duke University in 1985 and moved to WCU in 2006. I have served as PSDS Associate Director since 2003 and have been associated with PSDS since 1992. I am a member of the WCU research faculty and WCU graduate faculty and have over 25 years of interdisciplinary professional experience involving North Carolina coastal environmental management and policy issues, including the state's 2010 study on terminal groins. The following comments represent my professional opinions regarding the final environmental impact statement, FEIS, for the Holden Beach East End Shore Protection Project. Core Action ID number SAW 2011-01914, and are directed to the Holden Beach Board of Commissioners, as well as Mr. David Hewitt, Holden Beach Town Manager, and Mr. Alan Holden, Mayor of Holden Beach. According to the public notice dated March 15, 2018, the purpose of the proposed action is to establish a comprehensive shoreline protection program that will restore and maintain the East End Beach and provide for the short and long-term protection of residential structures, town infrastructure, and recreational assets. Also, according to the public notice, the proposed action is needed to mitigate ongoing and chronic East End shoreline erosion that threatens residential structures, town infrastructure, recreational assets, and natural resources. The FEIS further states that an independent shore protection program under the authority of the town is needed to ensure that the East End shoreline will be adequately protected. After reviewing the FEIS, it is my professional opinion that the town's preferred strategy, referred to as Alternative 6, intermediate terminal groin and beach nourishment in the FEIS, will not achieve any of the town's aforementioned objectives, and that's in bolded text. Based on my current review of the FEIS, objective fiscal economic assessments of terminal groins completed by PSDS, the North Carolina Division of Coastal Management, and Dr. Lynn Pietrafeza, among others, and empirical evidence resulting from nearly 30 years of coastal science and policy research. It is my professional opinion that the public cost of building and maintaining a terminal groin at Lockwood Folly Inlet will exceed the public benefits by a factor of 10 over the project's 30-year planning horizon, and any benefits that do accrue will be grossly inequitable in their distribution. In summary, the allocation or disbursement of public funds for the construction of a terminal groin on Holden Beach adjacent to Lockwood Folly Inlet is fiscally irresponsible and could well be viewed as a breach of fiduciary duty on behalf of the decision makers responsible for the health, safety, and public welfare of the town of Holden Beach, its citizens, and the many thousands more who visit, often for the primary purpose of using and enjoying the public beaches on Holden Beach. Although the FEIS provides pragmatic cost estimates, it fails to quantify estimated benefits of the preferred action. While this omission alone is typically enough to dissuade a responsible public body from undertaking a highly contentious and potentially damaging shoreline stabilization project, a number of other valid arguments can be made to support this conclusion. The remainder of my comments, however, focus on just one. A terminal groin does not make fiscal sense. As mentioned, the FEIS does not quantify potential benefits, Appendix O does, however, contain a significant amount of content dedicated to the hypothetical economic benefits of shoreline stabilization in general. The omission of real data along with verbiage that tends to support shoreline stabilization implies that the benefits of an intermediate terminal groin and beach nourishment have either not been calculated or do not support the preferred alternative and were omitted. While the omission of essential project data is uncommon in complex environmental documents such as this FEIS, large disparities in public benefits relative to public costs can be easily hidden in the array of procedures and policies used to create them. I think he meant to say one example is the misleading use of replacement value minus depreciation by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to define a perceived coastal development problem, quantify the perceived benefits of a preferred engineered shore protection action, favor that action, and justify the expenditure of large amounts of public funds on engineered shore protection projects that almost always fail to deliver as promised. In a nutshell, the Corps uses replacement value minus depreciation to estimate how much it might cost to replace a vulnerable coastal property minus depreciation if it's not protected, and then uses that value as a proxy for estimating the benefits of protecting that property. In other words, while it might cost $5 million to nourish a mile of eroding beach, the benefits of doing so, measured by the replacement value minus depreciation of every oceanfront structure sitting behind that stretch of beach, might exceed $50 million, resulting in a misleading at best benefit-cost ratio that overwhelmingly favors nourishment. The primary problem with the replacement value minus depreciation approach is that the benefits it identifies accrue almost exclusively to the private owners of vulnerable oceanfront property, not the public who is paying to protect them. While replacement value minus depreciation may be appropriate for privately funded shoreline stabilization projects, it fails to quantify the true public benefits of publicly funded shoreline management strategies such as this one. A more accurate way to measure potential public benefits of a publicly funded shoreline protection project is to calculate the tax revenue that protected properties will continue to generate as a result of being protected and compare that to the cost. According to the FEIS, the estimated net present value cost of Alternative 6, intermediate terminal groin and beach nourishment over the next 30 years, is approximately $19 million. In contrast, the estimated public benefits of our Alternative 6 measured in terms of the net present value of a continuous stream of ad valorem occupancy and sales tax revenue generated by properties that in theory will be protected by the groin, parentheses, damaged or destroyed without a groin, close parentheses, over the same 30-year period range from 1.5 million to 1.8 million, depending on the actual number of properties protected, as well as the discount rate and price appreciation rate used. In a hypothetical best-case scenario in which construction of a terminal groin prevents damage to every structure property for 30 years, the net present value cost of Alternative 6, $19 million, is still 10 times greater than the maximum possible return, $1.8 million, the town can possibly hope to recoup from its investment. An alternative to paying $19 million to protect $1.8 million in tax revenue, again, the absolute best-case scenario, is for Holden Beach to increase its municipal tax rate by approximately 1/3 of 1 cent. Doing so would offset all lost tax revenue over 30 years and cost the owner of a median value occupied home on the average of about $6 per year. Conversely, in a hypothetical worst-case scenario, Holden Beach spends $19 million, the groin fails, the town receives absolutely nothing in return and has to deal with a number of legal challenges that inevitably will arise. Even though the actual outcome is likely to fall somewhere between the two extremes, it is clear that the cost of building and maintaining a terminal groin at Lockwood Folly Inlet will exceed maximum potential benefits, all caps, in every single case, even if the proposed project works exactly as project proponents and consulting engineers hope, and without one single detrimental environmental impact. Based on the data and evidence made available to the board, a decision to proceed with Alternative 6 or any subsequent action that uses public funds to construct a terminal groin will almost certainly be viewed by the community as fiscally irresponsible and a breach of fiduciary duty. Submitted by Andrew S. Coburn, Research and Graduate Faculty Associate Director, Program for the Study of Developed Shorelines, Faculty Associate in the Campus Engagement for Sustainability, Western Carolina University.
Jeff, is it Gissler, Geisler, or Gissler? Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mayor and Board, for inviting me to speak tonight. I appreciate the opportunity. And so we've talked about this EIS, and I'm going to try to dive into it a little bit and talk about what it says, what it doesn't say, and what it gets right and what it gets wrong. And I should have backed up and said, I'm Jeff Gissler. I'm an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. And since the state lifted the ban on terminal groins in 2011, we've been closely monitoring this project, Ocean Isle, Figure 8, and Bald Head Island. And so this is now the fourth environmental impact statement that we followed through the scoping, draft environmental impact statement, and final environmental impact statement process. And so I'm going to try to jump in and give you all a little background on what's in the document, what it says about building a terminal groin, what it says about not doing anything, and what it says about continuing to do what you're doing now. And I'm going to start by talking about the law because I'm a lawyer. But it's more important than that, and I know that Mr. Wright talked about this a little bit earlier, but the National Environmental Policy Act is one of our most powerful laws, and the reason it's so powerful is because it puts out information to promote a public discourse. It gives decision makers information to base their decision on, and it's used to comply with other laws. Here, the state legislature has incorporated it to comply with the Coastal Area Management Act, and so it's part of the state law. It's also used by the Corps to comply with the Clean Water Act. How does it do that? How does it promote that public discourse? It does it by evaluating the environmental baseline. So you start with where you are, and you go from there and evaluate, well, what happens if we don't do anything? What happens if we go forward with the proposed project? And so it looks at a range of alternatives. And I'll talk a little bit about 3 of the alternatives that were considered in this environmental impact statement. You compare the effect of the alternatives both on the environment and economically. And so it's intended to give decision makers objective, accurate information. And when it doesn't do that, it doesn't comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. And so the final environmental impact statement here, it really revolves around the modeling that was mentioned earlier. And the modeled shoreline, different shorelines the different alternatives were modeled for 4 years to estimate what the shoreline would be, starting with the 2008 shoreline as year 0. There was data collected and used from 2000 to 2012, but the modeling that was used to analyze the different alternatives was a 4-year span. It evaluated 6 alternatives. I'm going to talk about 3 of those tonight. The first is the no action alternative, and that's if the town keeps doing what it's been doing for the last 15 years. Beach nourishment, piggybacking on the core projects, doing some beach nourishment on its own. The second alternative is if the town does nothing and no one does, there's never another grain of sand put on the east end of the beach. Everyone just walks away. So that's the $0 free option. And the other alternative I'll talk about is the proposed terminal groin. And the reason I'm focusing on these 3 is because they provide the second alternative, doing nothing, and the terminal groin, represent the 2 extremes. So the one that provides least protection, and then the one that is more engineered. And then alternative one is continuing to do what you're doing. So it gives an indication of what there is to be gained or not gained by the terminal groin. The modeling in the EIS revealed what we know from aerial photographs that date back to the late 30s, and that is that the issue here is limited to the east end. You can't probably see it very well because this is a very small photograph. But once you get to Blockade Runner Drive, all the alternative shorelines are the same. So no difference in alternative 1, 2, 3, all the way to 6. There's no difference west of Blockade Runner Drive. But the issue here is really narrower than that. So I forgot I had my green circle. So in this area that's highlighted by the green oval, there's no difference in the alternatives. The real focus of the EIS is right here on the row of houses east of Blockade Runner Drive. Now, as I mentioned, the terminal groin represents one extreme. And what it shows, the analysis shows, is that we're not even talking about all of the properties east of Blockade Runner Drive. Because what the EIS says is that in 4 years, if you build a terminal groin, 4 years later, 16 properties will be at risk. Those properties that are in the yellow box will all be at risk, which means they have high tide within 25 feet of the property. And you can see you can't see, it's a small picture, but there's a red line that shows high tide. It's coming underneath these houses. So that's what's predicted if the terminal groin is built. Those 16 properties are gone or significantly damaged. So those properties aren't really at issue either. Now, if we do nothing, then 28 properties are at risk, according to the modeling. So you have 16 that would have been affected even with the terminal groin. You have some to the west because the high tide line would move up higher. And then there are a few that are identified as at risk in dunescape that I think their property line must extend fairly far down, but that would not truly be at risk. So at most, the groin as modeled would provide protection to 12 more properties. And when you take out the dunescape properties, it's more 9 or 10. And so it's not only important to look at how many properties would be protected according to the modeling, it's important to look how they would be protected. You know, so what would the difference in building the groin be? And so for this, I'm going to compare what you're doing now, alternative 1, compared to what the beach would be like with a terminal groin according to the 4-year modeling run. And so to analyze that, the modeling was broken up into 3 zones. So you can see, you can probably see the boxes on the screen. They say west, middle, and east. Now the only zone that really matters here is the west zone, because that's where all of the properties are, all of the houses that could be vulnerable are. So it's important, so we can focus in on that western zone. And what the modeling predicted is that if you continue doing what you're doing now, that in that western zone, you'll have 27 feet of beach compared to doing nothing. So you'll have a wider beach than if you do nothing. If you build the terminal groin, you'll have 8 additional feet. So the protection that's provided to those 9 or 10 houses is 8 additional feet of beach. And an important thing to point out here is that there are two important things. First is that it's the same nourishment amount. 100 to 150 cubic yards is what they used. The second is that in the nourishment-only alternative, the alternative to continue what you've been doing, it's a 4-year gap. So it's not a 2-year or 3-year cycle, it's a 4-year cycle. So there was no nourishment in the interim. And so even based on the analysis in the EIS, there is very little to be gained from building this terminal groin. As Professor Coburn analyzed, it's the potential gain is additional protection for 9 or 10 houses at a cost of more than $34 million, according to the EIS. But the EIS isn't accurate in very important ways. It's inaccurate in very important ways. As I mentioned, alternative one is continuing to do what the town has been doing. And the starting point for the EIS analysis was 2008. So we have 10 years of doing what the town has been doing to compare to the analysis in the EIS to see if the analysis matches what has happened in reality. And for each alternative, the EIS breaks the alternatives down into different factors. It breaks it down into cost, into present value cost. It estimates how many properties will be affected. It estimates the infrastructure cost. It estimates the effects on recreation and aesthetics based on that beach width analysis. And it compares them either quantitatively or qualitatively. And what we can see based on the experience over the last 10 years is that the EIS gets alternative one, continuing to do what you've been doing, very wrong. So the first thing I want to point out is that the estimated cost. So this is where the $12 million savings comes from. The estimated cost is $46.2 million. So it's more than the estimated cost for the terminal groin. But we have a recent beach nourishment to compare to the nourishment analysis used in the EIS to come up with that cost. So last year, the town did a nourishment event on the east end. It was about 120,000 cubic yards of sand. Part of it was paid by the federal government. And I pulled this from the annual report from last year, so I couldn't get the exact breakdown. The state paid a significant share. It was unclear if the county paid any part of it, but the total cost was $465,000. The town's cost was at most $76,000. I couldn't figure out if that was before or after the state contributed. So I used that number because that's what was the highest value that the town's cost could have been. In the EIS, for the initial nourishment under alternative one, continuing the status quo, it is a 150,000 cubic yard beach nourishment effort. There is no federal cost share considered. There is no state cost share considered. There is no county cost share considered. The total cost is estimated to be $2 million, and all of it is paid for by the town. Now, there's one thing that I'll mention here is that alternative three, which I'm not going to talk about, actually considered that scenario where there was no continued cost sharing. Alternative one in the FEIS describes all of those cost sharing vehicles continuing and assumes that they will all continue. They just weren't considered in calculating the cost. And so if we go back to the chart where it lists and so multiplying 2 million times 15 nourishment events and adding in monitoring and those things, that's how you get $46 million. Based on the town's experience, most recently last year, we know that $46 million number is not accurate when federal, state, and county cost shares are included, and it's significantly inaccurate. And it doesn't reflect the alternative as described in the EIS. So that part of the analysis is not reliable. We also have the beach, and we've seen what nourishment over the last 10 years has done to the beach. And just to give you an idea, under alternative one, there would be about 650,000 cubic yards of sand put on the beach over the first 10 years. And based on the data I found, the town has done about 510 thousand cubic yards of sand over the last 10 years. And the beach is significantly wider than it was in 2008. It's in very good shape. And so the analysis of recreational and natural and aesthetic effects is also, in the EIS, is also not reflective of what's happened over the last 10 years. The 19 properties that would be at risk are not at risk if the same analysis is used to the beach as it exists now. The infrastructure that is lost, that is predicted to be lost in the first 4 years, was not lost over the last 10 years. And so when we get back to the analysis and the breakdown of the costs and the qualitative analysis, these properties, affected properties are not at risk, and so the tax value of them is not lost. The infrastructure was not lost. There was no reduction in tax base. There's no effect on, there's no environmental damage, which is the next category. And there was a benefit. The bottom few rows are whether there was a benefit. And there has been a benefit to those properties on the east end. So those values are also not reliable and don't reflect what the town has experienced over the last 10 years. And that is a problem. It's not, as a board, it should worry you when this is the easiest alternative to evaluate because we have real live data. So the analysis of this alternative is not reliable. It doesn't reflect reality, and it doesn't meet those standards that are required under NEPA. The same problems are present with the other alternative analyses. And so we will be closely following what the town does. We continue to be interested in how this proceeds, and we recommend that the town withdraw the permit with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that you step back, look at the success you've had over the last 15 years. Look at the success that has taken place with these beach nourishment events. The state has renewed its support for beach nourishment, has established this fund, and do what's been working. There has been, I've heard it from several places, the idea of getting the permits and sitting on them. We've worked closely with local property owners, with North Carolina Coastal Federation and Audubon, North Carolina. They're all very concerned about this permit, about these permits. And when a CAMA permit is issued, there are 20 days that any party has to file a challenge to that permit. And so the groups and the people that I work with will have to make that decision in 20 days. And the Clean Water Act permits have a longer timeline, but it's not a timeline that can wait. And so there is a better path forward than building this terminal groin. It is a significant risk to take based on 4 years of modeling that is not reliable. And we recommend that you withdraw the application for the permit. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Tracy, help me with your last name.
Obviously, I'm not Tracy Scrable.
Well, I was wondering, I wasn't,
I'm just as pretty, but I'm older. I'm Mike Giles. I'm recently retired from the North Carolina Coastal Federation as a coastal advocate, 6 days in retirement. I'm having the time of my life. My wife is keeping me busy. I'm not going to take much of y'all's time. Y'all know the public knows our position on hardening structures along the best coast in the United States. We're against hardened structures, terminal groins, jetties, et cetera, because there's a better way. As Jeff explained, as Clark explained when his analysis of NEPA and y'all's choices, but there are better ways. Look at the beach now. Look at what happened, as Jeff said, in the last 10 years, and it costs you very little if you got a better beach than you would have if you had constructed this terminal groin. 2 years ago, we had a meeting here, the Coastal Federation, sponsored with North Carolina Audubon, the Southern Environmental Law Center, Dr. Rob Young and Andy Coburn from the Western States of, what Clark said, PS, whatever it was. We had over 150 people attend that meeting. That was 2 years ago. The money y'all have spent on this EIS, you could have saved the town that money if you had made decisions then when this information was available. What Jeff said about, and if you look at Mason's Inlet and Bogue Inlet, where they moved inlet channels and they maintained those inlet channels where it feeds the beach with the Ebb Shoal Delta, you know, the Lockwood Follies Inlet is going to be dredged. And if you dredge it correctly, Coastal Federation recommends that all of our shallow water inlets be dredged minimally. But if you dredge it correctly with the right engineering, it will sustain that Ebb Shoal Delta out there and feed your beach, so you're saving money. Mason's Inlet, Bogue Inlet, they did the same thing. They decided not to put terminal groins in Mason's Inlet it was against the law, but Bogue Inlet just recently, the people in Rhode Island just said they do not want a terminal groin. And what Jeff said, I came here to deliver a message. What Jeff said, if a CAMA permit is issued, the Coastal Federation is already geared up. I just want to let y'all know we will challenge that permit. So you will have that additional expense of a legal challenge, not only on the CAMA permit, but the clean water permit and the Corps of Engineers permit. The Federation, I would assume the Property Owners Association would join in any permit in Audubon, North Carolina, but the Federation has made the statement. They sent me here to convey that message that it's, if you do proceed with your permitting and the CAMA permit is issued, the Federation will legally challenge that permit. Thank you.
Dunescape, your name, sir? Mr. J. Holden's going to entertain us. Thank you.
I'm your second cousin. I think you know my name. I'm Jay Holden. I'm on the board of directors of the Dunescape Property Owners Association. Dear Alan and commissioners, the Dunescape Property Owners Association Board of Directors appreciates the commitment of the mayor, commissioners, manager, and staff of the town of Holden Beach to preserving the East End Beach. We share your goal, but differ on the best way to achieve it. The Dunescape POA Board supports the continued beneficial placement of sand on the east end of Holden Beach from the dredging of the Lockwood Folly Inlet, waterway crossing, and bend wideners. We also strongly urge the Army Corps of Engineers and the town of Holden Beach to explore the option of keeping the inlet ebb channel in a south-southwest orientation while maintaining the historical width and depth. We oppose the construction of a groin on Holden Beach. The final environmental impact statement for the proposed Holden Beach Terminal Groin project shows, I saw 28 houses that have been lost to erosion on the east end of the beach since 1993, but no houses have been lost since 2001. For most of the time since 2001, the inlet channel has been oriented to the south-southwest, which is a favorable orientation for limiting erosion. That has allowed the beneficial placement of sand from the inlet crossing dredging to maintain a stable east end shoreline. We believe in continuing what has worked for the last 17 years. We support Alternative 1 in the EIS, with the addition of keeping the inlet channel oriented to the south-southwest. We oppose alternative 4 in the EIS because deepening and widening the inlet channel is predicted to worsen erosion on Holden Beach. With alternatives 3, 4, 5, and 6, the town of Holden Beach takes full responsibility for preserving the East End Beach. We believe that the federal, state, and county government should always share this responsibility because people from all over our nation, state, and county come to our beach to enjoy its beauty. The East End from Jordan Boulevard to the inlet has the vast majority of public parking and access on the island and is heavily used by the public. Despite hearing reports to the contrary for over 20 years now, we've observed that the federal government continues to pay 65% of the cost of many beach nourishment and dredging projects, like we just saw in the presentation by Jeff, the project we had on the East End last year, paid by the federal government 65%. We believe that strongly presenting our case in Washington will allow this funding to continue. We oppose Alternative 6, the proposed intermediate groin, for many reasons. First of all, in our view, it's not a terminal groin. Over 1,700 feet of public beach, 7 houses, and the Dunescape Recreation Area all lie east of the proposed groin. All of this will be placed at greater risk of erosion by the groin, especially when the fillet on the west side of the groin is eroded away, which a storm could do very quickly. The original concept was a long groin placed about 1,200 feet east of the current proposal. It was determined that this would not work because the inlet channel would rapidly migrate up against it, eroding the area east of it and undermining it. Let me just say, in other words, it looks to me like a terminal groin is not an option. A truly terminal groin. In fact, 2 long groin and 1 short groin options were eliminated because all of them would severely increase erosion to the east. If both the short and long options would do this, you can understand why the intermediate option is also unacceptable to us. We oppose the groin, and this goes to what Jeff has touched on also. We oppose the groin because it has a very limited and uncertain effectiveness that is far outweighed by the risk and cost. The EIS predicts that west of Avenue D, the mean high water line will be in the same location after 4 years, whether we have the groin or just keep doing what we are doing now. The only big difference is the beach immediately west of the groin will be wider, which skews the average beach width numbers and makes the groin look more effective than it actually would be. The groin is supposed to save money in the long run by reducing the frequency of renourishment. However, the EIS indicates that the groin will increase shoaling in the Waterway West Channel. That's on page 5-154. Currently, when the inlet crossing is dredged, the sand is placed beginning at the last house on McCrae Street and then to the west. Rules prohibit placing it further east because of concerns that it would get back into the inlet too soon. With the groin, sand will be placed 1,400 feet closer to the inlet than it is now. And since the groin increases the erosion risk on its east side, sand will be placed there. The EIS says that this sand will go into the Waterway West Channel quickly. Again, page 5-154. It appears that the groin will not reduce and may even increase the frequency of inlet crossing dredging. A groin will require the town to incur expensive monitoring costs to verify that it is not causing harm. Claims of harm could be hard to disprove and might cost the town unnecessary legal fees. A groin will detract from Holden Beach's natural beauty. Some property values may suffer, but this is a cost that cannot be measured simply in dollars. It will be a safety hazard. Modeling results show a groin will increase rip currents along the adjacent beach on a falling tide, page 5-147. People could be swept against it while swimming or swept out beside it. It will be a barrier to people walking on the beach at low tide, and some will get hurt while climbing on it. Finally, there is the risk to our descendants. In 2011, the state legislature voted to allow 4 terminal groins. No more were to be allowed until 4 had been built and enough time had elapsed to determine if they worked without causing harm. So far, only 1 has been built, and yet the state legislature has already voted to allow 6 groins. This is a red light flashing the words slippery slope. We do not want our generation to be remembered for putting our state on a slippery slope to a day when our beaches are ruined by growing fields. Thanks.
Thank you. Someone's going to speak for the HBPOA.
Tall people up here. Abnormally tall. My name is John Witten. I'm with the Holden Beach Property Owners Association. See a lot of familiar faces here. I think a lot of folks were here last Saturday when we addressed this issue. So I'll keep my comments very, very brief. For the few of you who don't know, the Holden Beach Property Owners Association represents property owners on Holden Beach. We think we represent about, we have members representing about half the homes on Holden Beach. As was said earlier, we followed this issue from the very beginning. 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, after the draft EIS had come out, we had surveyed, done an all-island survey. And what we found out, we were looking at both the Central Reach project, the Terminal Groin project, several other issues that were currently important to our membership. And at that time, what we found out was that most people had no idea what the Terminal Groin was. There was a great deal of confusion when people were asked questions about it. They said they didn't have enough information. So the first thing the Homeowners Association did was we conducted an informational meeting that occurred about this time of year, as I recall, 2 years ago. Some of the people that you've heard tonight spoke at that time. Representatives of the town and representatives of the consultants hired by the town to prepare the EIS were invited but declined to attend. After that meeting, there was a great deal of interest generated. There were about 150, 175 people that attended that meeting over in the chapel. And as a result of that, the HBPOA decided to appoint a committee to monitor the draft EIS. One of the reasons suggested for the town not responding more, not participating in that meeting was that a final EIS was just around the corner and we should wait and see what was in the final EIS. Well, we've all waited some 2.5 years. What we saw was a final EIS that they made very few changes, made very few responses to the substantive comments that were made. But during that 2 years, our committee continued to review. So I've read not only the draft EIS, but the final EIS. Someone said, I guess Clark, it makes for a fascinating bedtime reading. But interestingly, at the end of all of that reading and study, now my background, and I was the chairman of the committee, I'm not an oceanographer, I'm not an environmentalist. I have spent 30 or 40 years doing project finance. I've been involved in a lot of projects that have involved environmental impact statements. As I said last Saturday, the one unique thing about this from my perspective is in every other project I've ever been involved in, I was on the side of people that were hiring the consultants and hiring the engineers to design whatever project we were talking about. I do understand how the process works, and I sympathize to some degree with the proponents of the Terminal Groin project, because what you have is justifying a project that is necessarily damaging to some degree to the environment. That's why you in fact are having an environmental impact statement done. And so if you're going to justify that project, you have to show that there are not practical alternatives to that project. What we said last Saturday, and I think what has been repeated a couple of times here, is the state, or I shouldn't say the state, the Corps of Engineers has in some sense given us a gift. Because we've had, from the time data was gathered for the modeling that was done by the consultants and the initial runs that were done of their models back in 2012 that were 4 years out in advance, we've actually gotten to see what happened. You know, we have seen a successful protection of the beach for 4 years. That doesn't mean it will continue to forever. It doesn't mean it will always cost as little as it has cost over the last 10 years. But understand that the justification that has been given in the final EIS isn't about environment, it's not about oceanography, it's about economics. And that is what we at the HBPOA and on the committee really got down to and addressed was, this is being sold, we're not going to eliminate. The terminal groin, if it works exactly as designed by the engineers, and I have no basis to know whether that's true or not. But what the final EIS is saying is, with the groin, we'll have to do somewhat less nourishment of the beach. In the most sort of optimistic scenarios, we'll put 100 to 150,000 cubic yards on the beach every 4 years instead of every 2 years to get, as Jeff pointed out, substantially similar results. So all of a sudden, I feel comfortable with this because this is about economics. This is about business. This is about asking you, do you really trust the numbers in the final EIS, the economic numbers? And surprisingly, there really are very few economic numbers. It's almost impossible to follow the economic analysis. But what you can follow is that this is a 30-year commitment. There's very few things that you can say for certain about this project, but one of them is, when we decide every year or every other year to do beneficial nourishment on the east end of the beach or anywhere else, we're deciding it that year. We're going down, we're looking at the beach, we're finding out what the dredging schedule is going to be, we're running the numbers, and we're saying, hey, we can afford to do that this year. We're not committing for 30 years to anybody that we will do it year after year or every year after year. Understand that when we talk about the costs and when various people talked about the present value of this project, a lot of those costs, none of the costs in alternative one that Jeff talked about are fixed for 30 years. We could stop next year. We could decide we can't afford to do this anymore, or we have more pressing problems on down the beach or in the inland, in the intercoastal waterway, or we need to build a new sewer system or whatever. If we build this groin, this 1,000-foot long stone wall extending out into the ocean, 40 feet wide at the base, 10 feet wide at the bottom, we've signed a 30-year contract, in effect, with the government, with the federal government, and with the state that says we're going to take care of this. We bought it, we own it. As the engineers have said, it doesn't work. I mean, that was, you know, if you do not nourish the groin, it doesn't work. If you don't nourish the groin and you got an empty pile of rocks out there, sooner or later somebody's going to come along and make you tear it down. Imagine the costs associated with that. I know the FEIS tries to imagine that, and it's an interesting estimate. But a great deal of the cost for the terminal groin project is involved not in building it. Everyone's, you know, this thing isn't that, it's surprisingly inexpensive to build. If you believe the estimates in the FEIS, $2.5 million construction contracts. We're already $630,000 into the permitting process. Even if we don't get sued, let's call it $1 million to build it and plant it. Let's call it another couple $1 million to do the initial nourishment. You know, if we're lucky, we can do the first year of this thing for $4, $5, $6 million. That's not the big cost. The big cost is out in the future, and a lot of it is fixed because we have signed on to nourish that groin, come hell or high water, excuse the bad pun, for the next 30 years. And we've agreed to monitor it for the next 30 years. Not an insignificant cost. The monitoring costs range from $130,000 to $150,000 a year, maybe down to $65,000 a year in the out years. That adds up to a lot of money today. So when Jeff is talking about the $19 million present value of the groin project versus, you know, whatever the higher present value of what we're continuing to do, what that overlooks and hides is the fact, I did the numbers, about half of that $19 million present value, that's a hard number. That's money we're gonna spend no matter what. As opposed to saying that if we continue to be flexible, to remain flexible, to do what we can do, keep our options open. I mean, what our committee ultimately concluded and recommended to the HBPOA membership was this is too big a risk. You know, it's been said a couple of times before, there's a reason that the statute calls this a pilot project, an experiment. You know, we're the guinea pigs here, and we're being asked to sign a 30-year contract to be guinea pigs at a very, very high cost when we have the evidence before us that there's no guarantees on earth. There's no guarantees that the federal government's going to continue to help us pay for beach nourishment. There's no guarantees that someday we can no longer afford to protect what amounts to about 30 houses on the east end of the island. But we have to be sensible about what we're doing. We all, you know, the HBPOA supported the Central Reach Project, large supporter, got involved in helping with getting the easements for the Central Reach Project. There's been a lot of happiness, maybe some unhappiness with the first years of the Central Reach Project, but let's just compare these two projects and think about what we're talking about here. Not with made-up numbers, with the numbers that our final EIS, the document we paid $630,000 for, look at what it tells us. We are paying 10 times, based on the final EIS numbers, on a yearly basis, we're going to be paying about $1 million a year. I'm not going to do fancy present values and everything. The Central Reach Project was a 15-year project, cost $15 million. So round numbers, we're paying about $1 million a year for the Central Reach, $1 million a year signing up for the East End project. The East End project protects 2,500 feet of beach. If you looked at the yellow boxes that Jeff put, that's 2,500 feet versus 4.1 miles. In other words, for the same amount of money, we're protecting 10 times the amount of beach. 30 houses at the outside that we're talking about protecting at the East End versus, depending on how you count them, something between 450 and 500 houses in the Central Reach. You know, we have limited resources. Whatever we do, we got, you know, a couple $1 million a year of occupancy tax. We can't increase it except by, you know, renting our houses more. We got a $1.2 billion tax base. You know, if we're going to pay just the $5 million for the first year, we got to finance that. We got to find that money. If we're going to pay that $1 million a year, we've already committed for the next 15 years, the next 12 years, for the special obligation bonds that cover the Central Reach. We've committed a lot of that occupancy tax, that sand money, to servicing that debt. Where do you think, who do you think is going to pay for this? I will wrap up because I promised to be short, but I love history like Clark does. I love seeing the pictures of Fort Macon, and it's cool. You know, and I'm glad that the state of North Carolina and the federal government are preserving Fort Macon. 1.2 million people a year visit Fort Macon. The channel is a busy channel. It's a deep water channel. One of the interesting things we saw was all these wonderful pictures of groins everywhere. Not one of them looked the least little bit like the island of Holden Beach. You know, Fort Macon, you've got a deep water channel. The Oregon Inlet, you got a deep water channel. But the most interesting thing about it is who paid for it. Make no mistake, the taxpayers of Holden Beach are picking up the bill for the terminal groin. You know, in Fort Macon, in the Oregon Inlet, that's the federal government, that's the states. In both of those places, in Fort Macon, we're protecting a priceless historic structure visited by 1.5 million or 1.2 million people a year. And as I pointed out to Clark this morning, despite what some people think, I know it looks like a wreck right now. That was not beach erosion. That was 500 Union Army artillery shells in the 1860s. And somehow it's still there. But it wasn't paid for by a handful of people, by a small town on Holden Beach. Same thing with Oregon Inlet. We're protecting a, God knows how many, hundreds of millions of dollars of bridge across the Oregon Inlet. We don't have the money. We cannot afford to take this kind of risk with our limited resources. And that's why last Saturday, the board of the Holden Beach Property Owners Association voted 9-1 to recommend to its membership, our members, when they took us, or I shouldn't say our members, the whole island of Holden Beach. 2 years ago, people said they didn't know anything about the terminal drawing, wanted to learn more. 2 years later, when they knew something, last fall, when they took that same all-island survey, only 20% of homeowners responding to the survey, and that was about, Vicki, you tell me, 400 or 500 people responded to that survey, which is a tremendous turnout for Holden Beach. Only 20% of them wanted to build a terminal groin. The rest of them wanted to keep doing what we were doing or didn't want to do anything at all, but they didn't want a terminal groin. We got 5 commissioners sitting up here. Every one of them came to the the Holden Beach Property Owners Association sponsored Meet the Candidate Night. They all said they were opposed to the terminal groin. They stood up and said it in the meeting. They said it in their questionnaires as well, that they were opposed to the terminal groin. Now we've come to the moment of truth. We've been kicking a can down the road for 6 or 7 years on the terminal groin. As you've heard tonight, we've run out of road. It is a pipe dream to imagine that we can say, thank you very much, Corps of Engineers, for your permit. We're going to put it in our pocket and we'll sit around and wait and see how this feels 2 or 3 years from now. That isn't an alternative. That's not on offer tonight because, as you've heard, there's homeowners, there's taxpayers, there's environmental groups, there's ocean protection groups who are all lined up. Same people who are suing Ocean Isle right now will be suing us. So we're not going to get this, this federal permit, much less the CAMA permit, for another $25,000. We're going to get it after years and years of costly litigation that we may very well lose in the end. We've spent $630,000. What we've got is a big stack of books. That is a terrible shame that we spent that much money, but that's gone. There's a word for people who keep throwing money into the pot in the middle of the table when they got a losing hand, and that's called that's called bankrupt people. That's where we're headed. We can't keep doing this year after year. The time to call the question is now. There's no more information we're ever going to get. We paid $630,000 for a lot of information, and now it's time to move on and move on and protect the east end of the island and keep doing what we're doing in the channel. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Madam Clerk, have you determined how we're going to collect the questions?
I could go if anybody has questions, I could just come around and grab them if that works for you. Anybody has any questions?
I was hoping for a wheelbarrow full here.
You are.
All right, first one. I don't know whether, maybe come to the microphone, Fran Way. Yours happen to be at the top here. Okay, was all of the modeling done with old inlet configuration, referencing figure 7-37 and other photos, old configuration?
No, it was I think we modeled it mostly with the configuration to where the inlet was closer to the Holden Beach side of the inlet. Obviously, and even that article with the Civil War wreck, which just came out, a week ago, we always kept the channel away from the Civil War wrecks because, that's kind of typical. And it hasn't been over on the Oak Island side for the channel. Hasn't been over there for, I don't know, a decade or so. What's that?
The data's a decade old.
Okay, even more than a decade. I think it was around, 2006 or so, or when it came around to the Holden Beach side, and it's been there for a while.
It was my question.
Okay,
It was because the picture showed it to the Oak Island side.
okay.
Okay, the reason I was ordered to collect the questions is to eliminate
Sorry.
being here all night.
Yes.
Second question for Mr. Franway. You said that there are no effects down drift. A, what are you? What is that?
I need some help.
What is that word?
Define.
What are you defining as down drift?
The downdrift effects, we're talking to the central reach portion of beach. The inlet, the sand travels around, and it's a little complex, but basically it's designed as a leaky structure. As Spencer mentioned that some groins can be designed as leaky. This one, similar to the Bald Head Island one, was designed as leaky to allow some sand to get through to the downdrift side. The downdrift side in this instance is in the inlet. But when I was talking about no downdrift impacts, I was talking about the Central Reach Project shoreline.
Okay, follow-up question. If downdrift is west of the groin, how do you know? I'm just reading the question.
Yeah, there's a nodal area, quote unquote nodal area, where you have gross transport that goes both east and west, but then you have net transport. And a lot of the inlets, and this happens in even like old Miles Hayes coastal geology books from the 60s. If you look at all of schematics, we have some schematics in the engineering report, at the inlets, there's usually a nodal area where the net transport changes from east to west, and we've documented and modeled the nodal area along the shoreline to be over near Avenue A or so, or near Blockade Runner.
Okay, still Mr. Franway, what is the cost of the status quo alternative? Is the cost based on the town's actual past expenditures? If not, why not?
Yes, and again, that speaks to the length of this process, where we did, our process was basically back in about 2012, 2013, when we came up with this costing analysis. Back then, the state dredging fund there was talk about it and it was established, but was not funded. In about 2014 was when the state dredging funds really started kicking into gear and was robust. All of our calculations were basically based on taxpayer funds, and we didn't really differentiate between federal taxpayer money, state taxpayer money, or town taxpayer money.
Okay. If a terminal groin is constructed, will dredging of the Lockwood Folly Inlet continue? If so, will the town continue to participate in cost sharing and beneficial placement arrangements?
Yes, the modeling does indicate, and I'm not sure, the EIS is 1,000 pages or so of material. Okay. Well, with that much information there can be, you can pull things out of context or cherry pick other sentences, but basically it indicated that the groin would keep a percentage of that material from going back into the inlet to reduce the sedimentation rates in the inlet. But it's also a leaky structure where there would be dredging still. And obviously, now with that state dredging fund, Oak Island has expressed interest in that area, and even the county has started talking about taking sand for dredging purposes and putting it elsewhere, not on the east end. And that's a real concern for Holden Beach. And I've already, the town and the Board of Commissioners have been, really kind of sticking their feet in the sand about Holden Beach should get that material. Holden Beach should get priority to that material. But there's a lot more pressure on that, especially with that anything dredging related, where 2/3 of the funding is getting paid for by the state. There's a lot more pressure for that bar area, and I guess we'll just have to kind of keep playing. It's a bit of a moving target, and this was a long process.
All right, Mr. Rogers, if you would you join Fran Way up here? We're gonna hit you both with the same question. If the sand at the shoreline is moving into the inlet, why is large fillet on the west side? Fillet, okay. That sounds like something you eat. Fillet like in a spit, okay?
So, so the sands, can you repeat the question really quick?
If the sand at the shoreline is moving into the inlet, why is large fillet on the west side?
Well, so
Fillet fillet.
it's trapping,
What
the material's going, if this, the groin's here, and the material is on this side, because the material is going that direction.
Neither of us are gonna be able to answer a complex question like that in detail, sitting here with no pictures and no pencils. Every inlet is a complex combination of shoals and wave impacts, wave height incoming in directions, and all of those make a big difference in where the sand goes and how it sits around. You can generalize that because of the shoal effects, on the shoreline of the island adjacent to the inlet, sand moves into the inlet from both directions. When you get close to the inlet, it's always going into the inlet, because sand goes offshore where the ebb currents, it always comes inshore with the incoming currents. That's a fact. But how that works around and where there's a shoal here and not there, that's too complicated to answer in a simple question like that. Show me some pictures and we can hand wave why this happened there, or can we predict it? Probably not.
All right. Fran Way, we through with you, thank you, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Rogers, will the proposed terminal groin stabilize the inlet, or will it still migrate, wag back and forth?
I'm glad you asked. I have no idea. No, I've intentionally not studied, I have not read the report, I've not looked at the design, and have really no way to comment specifically on what's proposed. So if you got a generic question, I'll be happy to address it, but I can't answer it in your groin.
Fran Way, I apologize to you. Hop back up here, please. My mistake. I didn't see the small print. I think we're done with you, Mr. Rogers. Thanks. Fran Way, I understand the bid of the initial construction of the Ocean Isle groin is $1 million more than the estimated cost of the Holden Beach project, even though the Ocean Isle configuration is 25% shorter. Is the estimate of the Holden Beach groin understated?
No, I don't think so. We looked at the cost for the Bald Head Island groin, and especially some other groins that were recently constructed and not just bid. We do not think so.
All right. Number 2, does the cost of the groin include any cost of the acquisition of the private property required for the anchor segment of the groin?
we looked at parcels and recently, we're doing a groin rehabilitation project right now on Folly Beach. And, you know, we looked at costs per linear foot, back to the original question. So, no, we're good with that number, that 2.5 million estimate. The rock prices actually are coming down a little bit, it seems like, and Crowder out of Charlotte there's some new players in the groin construction that are really kind of started to bring down some costs. To the new question, can you repeat that really quick?
The one I just gave you?
Yeah, sorry, that was the previous question.
All right. Does the cost of the groin include any cost for the configuration of the private property required for the anchor segment of the groin?
When we looked at parcel data, we were pretty careful to stay off other people's parcels, so we wouldn't have to do any easements. And then that anchor section, technically, we don't even need to build that anchor section. That anchor section kind of is 300 feet, where you can almost phase that, where that's if there was really an incredible erosion event, where you could see some flanking, you could go back, but no, we were going to stay away from individual parcel owners, and we kind of looked at that pretty carefully to stay away from parcels that we would have to get some sort of easement or something.
Next question. The EIS estimates the cost of the town, or to the town, for the loss of the tax revenue if the houses west of the groin are damaged from erosion. Is there any cost estimate for the anticipated reduction valuation for the property located at or east of the groin?
I did not do the EIS, and the third-party contractor who worked with the Corps did a lot of that, and then they also hired a economics professor to do an analysis. So I don't think I can answer that question.
Thank you, sir. Have I omitted to recognize anyone's question that was submitted? All right, that concludes the list of questions that were turned in to me. So are we now at number 9 on the agenda? Is that where we are?
Yep, number 9.
Number 9, time for public comments on any general items. If you want to speak to anything, come speak in the microphone to my right and give us your name so we can get it on record.
I'm Rhonda Dixon, and I want to thank everybody for all the time and effort that was put into this tonight. I know it wasn't easy, and I know there's two sides to every story, but I want to thank everybody for presenting. I, of course, support the and oppose the terminal groin for all the reasons that were mentioned tonight. But I want to thank both sides because I know it's not easy. I know it's difficult. I thank the commissioners and the mayor and everyone for your time and effort and work over long periods of time. It's a great, great thing. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else want to speak to anything, any subject? All right. Is there a motion we adjourn?
Before we do, sir, can we not thank the speakers, the people who volunteered their time? You
All
did a great
right.
job. We appreciate that. We wanted to educate the public, and these people came out and volunteered to do that, so we want to thank them. I move we adjourn.
Motion adjourned. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion adjourned. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Thank you all for being here.